Today we're going to look at the French Revolution, and we'll continue with the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was the sort of idea framework, the ideological framework within which the revolution unfolded. And we can say that certainly John Locke and Newton and ultimately Adam Smith made very important contributions to the Enlightenment. It showed that the universe was a totality which operated according to rational principles, and that pursuit of reason, positivist reason, was the basis upon which one could gain a certain knowledge. And these ideas certainly shaped thinking in England in the 18th and on into the 19th century, but they had especially important effects in France. And the thing is that England was a constitutional monarchy by the beginning of the 18th century. The middle class, through Parliament, ruled. The aristocracy continued, the church, the established church, and the monarchy, but they all had to sort of defer to the parliamentary sovereignty. And this meant that the middle class, the class that was basically directing the development of a capitalist economy, was now in control of the state. But in France, it was quite different. We saw France at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, was ruled by Louis XIV. France was feudal and absolutist in government, as against capitalist and constitutional. And within that context, the nobility and the upper clergy, the bishops, the great abbots of the church with their great lands and so on, the nobles and the established church, they were privileged. They had obviously vast amounts of wealth, landed wealth, but they had special privileges judicially. Before the law, they had the society that was composed of commoners, and then there was the church and the nobility, and they had a special place recognized in law. And furthermore, they had tax exemptions. They were exempt from taxation. Clergy sometimes paid a special tax to the king and so on when he needed it, but essentially they were exempt from taxation, and the nobility was more or less exempt from taxation. The nobility said, we pay in blood because we fight for the king, and therefore we shouldn't be taxed. Now, this kind of society, increasingly as the 18th century wore on, came into conflict with the growing economic realities in France. For one thing, the rise of the middle class, the development of capitalism within the body of French absolutism. Capitalism, the middle class was rising, meanwhile, the mass of the people, whose numbers were growing, fell into increasing misery. So you have a privileged upper class, you have a rising middle class, and you have an increasingly immiserated, impoverished lower class. That was the situation in France as it developed in the 18th century. What was notable was there had been misery in France for centuries. This is nothing new. But what was new was the rise of the middle class. And French capitalism grew within this context through the 18th century, not without problems, but it grew. All sorts of institutional blockages developed to the further advance of capitalism, and the middle class felt itself, although its wealth was increasing, its social and political rights were restricted by the system of privileges. The church and the nobility had all of the plum jobs in the whole administrative structure, and they were excluded. And moreover, this upper class despised the middle class, treated that these were money people, and the upper class regarded them as fundamentally inferior to them, which infuriated the middle class. And so what we see is that the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of Newton and of Locke, and more latterly Adam Smith with his ideas of laissez-faire, were mobilized by intellectuals who came from the middle class. They were called the philosophers, or as they say in French, les philosophes, the philosophers, a group of individuals, intellectuals, and there were scores of these people. The most important, I'm naming some names, see keywords, were Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot. You'll find them in keywords listed today. But there were scores of others. And the Enlightenment is very interesting because there's great diversity of thought. It's really the birth of modern secular scientific thinking in many departments. So I'm simplifying, greatly simplifying. But nevertheless, we can say that many understood, these philosophers, that nature operated according to rational principles. And therefore, they argue that society and its institutions, being a part of nature, society, the state, the institutions of the state, they too should operate according to rational principles. Society should be organized on a rational basis. It should conform to the laws of nature. And so society should be reorganized as part of nature. And by this they meant that the society and its institution should be organized on basically what was rationally and empirically true. And on the contrary, what they saw then was a society which based itself on irrational traditions, customs, unproved religious ideas, and so-called innate truths of one kind or another. And these are the invoking of tradition or custom or faith or innate ideas. It was the nobility and the church and the monarchy which invoked these sort of unproved concepts to justify their social and political power. And basically what the middle class intellectuals are saying, this is tradition, custom, religion, it's not proven, nothing. We want a social reorganization which is based on rational empirical principles. So you can see that in a way this was a deeply subversive kind of movement. Nevertheless, it became extremely popular, and thousands and tens of thousands of books were published in France in the 18th century, which espoused such ideas. And in particular, you find that um, these philosophes zeroed in on the church, which had, as I say, privileges, and something like 25 and 30% of the property in France belonged to the church. Um, and there was a continuous stream of anti-clerical writing that went on. The clergy didn't deserve the property. They lived in idleness. They enjoyed these unwarranted privileges, and their ideology was basically superstition. It's not true, not based on reason. Now, in particular, I'm pointing out one of the things that was criticized was the church's idea that human unhappiness, the unhappiness that we experience living through our lives, the church said, the fact that our life experience, the life experience of 18th century people in France, was based on original sin. Basically, God was punishing humanity for basically the sin of Adam and Eve, and so on, biting the apple, and so on, against God's will. And so humanity was under original sin, and it had to spend, through the church, you took the sacraments in order to sort of mitigate, and you lived a good life in order to mitigate the terrible sinfulness of humanity. However, going back to John Locke, the philosophe said, well, this original sin and so on, that we know that, in fact, human experience and human personality and human thinking is all based on our experiences. It's not based on original sin. Knowledge, or what we become as human beings, is shaped by experience, not by a priori religious dogma or ideas, said Locke, and said the philosophe. And so they argue that, yes, humanity is unhappy, human beings are unhappy. We see that there's great suffering and unhappiness in the world, but basically this is the result of a sequence human beings experienced in France in the 18th century, a series of negative experiences. Little kids get beaten up by their mom and dad, kicked around, and it shapes their personalities. The schools are insofar as people can get an education at all, kids get beaten up, and there's authoritarian education, and then beyond that, because of impoverishment and so on, people have suffer and so on. So far from being the unhappiness and the evil in this world being the consequence of some original sin, it's actually our experiences as human beings which makes us unhappy. And then the next step they took was to say, in fact, if you were to sort of have better family lives, if you had better educational institutions, and if society was organized in a more rational fashion, people's experiences would begin to become positive. And there would be accumulation of positive experiences. So in contrast to the unhappiness we see at the present, if in fact the inputs into human experience were rather of a reinforcing and positive nature, if society, the family, the institutions, education were reformed in a positive sense, people would become happy. And indeed, they argued further, and they said that this sort of gradual accretion or increase in general happiness, if society kept changing for the better, then the quantity of happiness in society would increase, which led them to the idea that it was possible for there to be regular progress. Society could, instead of eternally human beings experience eternal sort of stagnation, society could actually move ahead, and there could be a progressive development of human society in a positive direction. And this, of course, these philosophers were the first people to sketch out what we call the idea of progress. The idea of progress. They invented the idea of progress, human progress. They also, the philosophers, in the 18th centuries, this is sort of a continuation of what started in the 16th century, there were many people who were traveling all over the world. Voyagers from Europe or the colonial experience and so on, people wrote about different societies. And so, for example, there were books written about China in the 18th century in Europe, and they said, well, the Chinese do things differently than we do, and in fact, we can see that China in some ways is better. Maybe we can learn, instead of sort of staying in the old European and sort of Western Christian tradition, maybe we can learn from these Chinese people. Or we see the North American Indians, and in certain respects, their society seems to be better than ours. Maybe they treat children better than we do. And so maybe we can learn from them. Or they visited Tahiti, and they saw the sort of idyllic life of the South Sea Islanders, the Tahitians in the Pacific. People wrote accounts of how happy these people seemed to be. And so they were what we call a certain cosmopolitanism, an openness to other societies, getting away from the ethnocentric idea and looking and getting examples, positive examples from other people. And finally, a certain humanitarianism characterizes these philosophers. Some of them, like Rousseau, wrote about the experience of children and how important it was that children be treated, this was a new idea, be treated well in terms of their upbringing and also be given a positive education. Or we talked about the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, that came out of a certain growing humanitarianism. So these are some of the ideas that the philosophers had. And of course I'm elaborating them because they are the ideas on which the French Revolution based itself. Many of these ideas that I'm speaking of. Now, in terms of economics, laissez-faire was the increasing. The state is the state in France, which, as you know, is an absolute state, the bureaucracy. The middle class felt that it was inhibiting the development of capitalism. So increasingly, they espoused the idea of laissez-faire. It's a French word. Let things alone. The state shouldn't interfere. And there was the first person to sort of espouse this in France was a guy by the name of Turgot, and a little bit later, Adam Smith, whose books became quite popular on the eve of the French Revolution. Now, the philosophes, these people that I'm talking about, Voltaire, etc., they were not revolutionaries. What they wanted was reform. They were not revolutionaries. They espoused the idea, all of these changes that they began to speak about could be carried out by, if the monarchy became enlightened, pick up these ideas could be implemented, and there needn't be any kind of violence. And in the end, if we look for a political program, that these people espouse. First of all, they believed in the abolition of privilege. There should be equality before the law, that the privileges of the nobility and the upper clergy should be ended, and that everybody should have equal opportunity. It didn't say everybody should be equal. Only a very few people were socialist-minded. This was not a socialist movement for the most part. They believed in what they called careers open to talents. They were talking about the middle class, their class. That the upper nobility, the nobility were blocking the way of the middle class. So everybody should be equal before the law, and there should be careers open to talent. So this was the ideological framework of the French Revolution. These were the ideas, and I said last time, and I want to underscore that, without ideas, you can have no revolution, no real fundamental change in society, because you have to have a roadmap, you have to have some sort of a framework. Otherwise, it's just sort of anarchy and random protest without any sort of organizing principle behind it. Well, this was then the ideological basis of it. And what we see then in 1789 is the outbreak of revolution. And the revolution is led by the middle class against the nobles and against the church and against the absolute monarchy. But you should understand that the middle class is literally that. It's not everybody. Today, you'll still hear blah, blah, the media say, oh, the middle class, and so on. And they say that everybody in Canada is middle class. Rubbish. People with a lot of capital, people with means, merchants, manufacturers, bankers, that's who I'm talking about. They led the revolution. And the common people, in their desperation, followed. And they had their own agendas, different from this upper class. And at the end of the day, what happened was the nobility and the church were displaced, and the bourgeoisie took power, and the common people just relapsed into being common people. That was the essence of it. The middle class took over power. Now, let's talk about how this happened. Well, the middle class was rising in the 18th century. Louis XIV died in 1715. His reign was a disaster, as I explained. But the French economy recovered, and indeed experienced unprecedented growth in the 18th century, directed by the middle class. Especially, France fully participated in the commercial revolution. Overseas trade and colonialism was the driving force of the French economy in the 18th century. And France, of course, the English, you can say that the English were in the lead, but the French were, even though they were under absolutism and feudalism, they followed. They were serious competitors with the English. French capitalism, despite the burdens it bore, nevertheless moved ahead, especially the overseas trade. So we see the French merchants and so on, the French state, trade booms with the Ottoman Empire, with Canada, with the Caribbean, with India. The French overseas economy is booming. And notable in this development of the economy are the Protestants, or as they were called, the Huguenots. They are the most active element in the French economy, the Protestants. Remember the Protestant ethic. This is these Huguenots are in the lead in terms of developing this economy. And the French manufacture and export all kinds of stuff like linen and cloth and silk, wool cloth. They also manufacture iron and steel objects, which they sell to their colonies. They sell to the slave plantations and so on. There's a booming economy, and I explained that Haiti was at the focus. 500,000 slaves, fabulous wealth coming out of their sugar plantations. But also you see Canadian fur, tobacco, indigo, etc. And we see that it's particularly around the periphery of France, in the big port cities like Rouen or Marseille or Nantes or Le Havre, these cities you can see around the periphery where the ports are, where export and import is taking place, in the surrounding areas. There are huge sort of putting out manufacturing industries around these great ports developing. But Paris too is experiencing a lot of growth in the 18th century, becomes a splendid city. And we could say that even a certain amount of concentrate, lagging the English, but nevertheless, there's a certain development of, for example, in the cotton industry becomes factories, mechanization, there's a certain mechanization in the cotton factories, in the chemical industry, which is associated with basically dyeing cloth, dyeing cotton, dyeing linen. There is a certain concentration of industry. And in and around Paris, in the region around Paris, which is very much like Manitoba in terms of very rich tableland, agricultural land, a definite capitalist agriculture develops in what's called the Ile-de-France and north towards the English Channel. That area, a certain capitalist farming develops, like England, southern England, in the 18th century. So that's the way it was, but otherwise we can say that despite this growth, the economy overall lagged behind, particularly when you compare it to England, because basically most of the economy remained on the level of small-scale production. Small-scale production. The French development did not match England in terms of the development of industry, and we'll see this next time. No, it was small-scale production. That there was a lack of capital investment. There was productivity was not comparable to what the English were doing at this time. And the reasons for this was that there were too many barriers in the first place to the kind of industrial takeoff in France. If you can believe it, in France in the 18th century, there were actually tolls had been set up by big noblemen, which collected taxes. If a merchant passed on the road, they had to pay taxes to these tolls, to these people who had, aristocrats who had the right to tax merchandise as it passed. There were, the roads themselves were poor, generally, compared to, say, England or other places in Europe. And there was no common system of weights and measures in this country. The whole system of weights and measures were provincial. Every province, every town had its own system of weighting. And this, of course, is a barrier to trade. But more important was the fact that there was a lack of demand in French society. Most people were peasants or craftsmen, and they were poor. So they didn't have money to buy what French producers were manufacturing. And so the market was restricted internally. That's why I stress the overseas market, because the internal market was weak. Now, these are major contradictions, but also we see that the privileged classes took advantage of the situation, the aristocracy and the church, and the monarchy, because we know, and it's been analyzed, that a huge percentage of whatever surplus was produced in society fell into the hands of the aristocracy or the church or the monarchy and was not invested in productive activity. It was basically spent on luxuries or war rather than invested in productive activity. And indeed, the advantage of the landed upper class was augmented or increased by virtue of the fact that right through the 18th century, they're steadily raising rent on the land. The peasants have to pay. They have to pay more rent. The rent is increased. Why is that? Because the population is growing rapidly from 18 million at the beginning of the 18th century to 28 million at the end of the century. And therefore, there's this growing demand for land. So the landlords can raise the rents. And all of that rent increase goes to this privileged landed class. Beyond that, the nobles, seeing that some of these bankers and big merchants are getting rich and they don't like it, these upstarts, these parvenus, the nobility make it their business to ensure, because of their influence with the king and with the government and with the court, that no bourgeois can get a significant office in the French state, in the French army, in the French navy, or the French church. They are excluded from offices in the church. These are reserved for the nobles. That is the overall situation, but as the 18th century as it proceeds, the situation really deteriorates for the common people. They're paying higher rent, but the most serious problem is the cost of food, because the French agriculture, for lack of investment, is not particularly productive. Meanwhile, the population has risen by about 40% at the end of the 18th century. So food prices keep going up. And occasionally, if there's bad harvests, you can get an actual bread becomes too expensive and people can't feed themselves. And as a result, from about the 1750s onwards, in the countryside and in the towns, there are growing food riots. People rise up. It is, they say, there is a moral economy. The king has a responsibility to nourish and protect his people. But we have no food. And therefore they rise up. They pillage the granaries. They attack the bakeries. They attack government officials and so on. And these riots get more and more serious as the French Revolution approaches. And indeed, what you have to understand is that the French Revolution actually broke out 1789 in the midst of one of these serious food shortages. People were hungry. Price of food was very high, and people became mobilized. They became mobilized by the political ideas because everybody was discussing one way or another the ideas of the Enlightenment. But their bellies were empty, and that was a condition which led to social and political upheaval. But the actual crisis, so these are the preconditions I've given you, preconditions. You have basically an increasingly miserable and impoverished population. You have a dissatisfied middle class for the reasons I've given. And you have these political ideas that have been circulating. And this sets the stage. But the actual crisis comes about because the French state becomes bankrupt in 1789. It experiences a state bankruptcy. And basically, the bankers will not loan the French state any more money. And why is that? Because in the course of the 18th century, I explained their big rival was the English, and the French fought a series of colonial wars with the British right through the 18th century, 1727 to 34, 1756 to 63, 1789 to 1776 to 83. And then we could continue and say 1793 to 1815, a series of wars with the English, basically over commercial rivalry. And these wars were very expensive. The court of Marie Antoinette spent a lot of money on luxury, but the main expense was these wars, which were, each one successively was more and more expensive. And at the end of the day, the French economy did not produce the taxes because the economy was weak, to support these wars. And so at the end, by the 1780s, it was realized that the state needed more resources. And so the monarchy turned to the church and to the aristocracy. Said, we know that the common people have no means to pay more taxes. You will have to pay. Well, the nobles and the church refused. And they said that they found a clever way of doing this. They said, well, Your Majesty, there exists this institution, the Estates General, which is the old French Parliament that flourished during the Middle Ages and had fallen into disuse with the absolute monarchy. The last time it met was in 1614, almost 200 years before. Your Majesty, in order for you to tax the nobles, this is a constitutional precedent, you have to call the Estates General. And there was a struggle over this. There was a big struggle, a political struggle. People became politicized as a result of this struggle, and the nobles said, oh, we're no taxation without representation. They invoked the American Revolution. We're for the people. They developed a kind of demagogic rhetoric, the nobles, spokesman of the nobility. And so the king, the desperate, ultimately in the fall of 1788, he agreed. And he summoned the Estates General to meet in the spring of 1789. And during that whole period, everybody talked about politics and taxes and so on. And all these grievances developed, political consciousness. And so the atmosphere was extremely tense when the Estates General met in May of 1789. And immediately an impasse developed because there were traditionally each of the estates of the realm met separately. There was the Chamber of the Nobles, there was the Chamber of the Church, and there was the Chamber of the Common People, the Commons. And everybody was aware that when push came to shove, the two upper bodies would always vote the same way to protect their privileges, and therefore the common people would be outnumbered in any kind of vote. And so the common people, the commons, the third estate, refused to basically meet in a separate chamber. They said all the people, all the representatives, nobles, church, and members of the third estate should meet together in a single chamber. And so there's this impasse, and finally in June of 1789, the third estate declared itself the National Assembly. They basically said that the other two chambers of the nobles and the church were illegitimate. There was only one legal chamber. It was the National, the Third Estates Chamber was now the National Assembly. Well, this was a revolutionary political act. And when the king tried to close, becoming alarmed, he sent soldiers to close the parliament. The members of the parliament, they were locked out of their chamber, and so they went to a tennis court nearby and took an oath not to refuse to disperse. The king at that point summoned the army, which was on the frontier, to march on Paris to put down this, obviously, this rebellion. The situation in Paris and at Versailles, which was where the National Assembly was, became more and more tense. Remember, there's this subsistence crisis going on. And the people in Paris, there were 500,000 people living in Paris at this time. They were hungry, and they had these ideas of the Enlightenment in their head. And so people, after speeches, decided that they would attack the royal fortress in the center of Paris, the Bastille, which was this huge royal fortress and prison in the center of Paris. And the Parisians rose up July 14th, 1789. This is the national holiday of France. And they seized the Bastille. They seized the city hall. They seized the city government. And the royal authorities were swept aside, and new, what they called communes were established in Paris. As soon as word of this reached all the other cities and towns of France, similar uprisings occurred, led by the middle class, but followed by the people. The same process. The royal army was the royal government was swept aside. The people had arms, and there was nothing that the government could do. To make things even more serious, in the countryside, the peasants, they also rose. They attacked the chateaus of the landlords, and they particularly seized the rent rolls, which recorded what their feudal obligations were to the landlords, and they burned them up. And so, really, this was an unprecedented, what we can say is that for the first time in human history, the people entered history. The people rose up. That's the meaning of this. This is the birth of modern times, because we're dealing with what this situation has resonated through all the succeeding decades and generations. We're still dealing with this act. So this is the birth of modern history. Of course, we saw, after, I would add as well, people were hungry in October. The women in Paris, hungry, couldn't feed their families. Again, women, for the first time, marched on the Palace of Versailles and forced the king and the queen to come back to Paris. They became prisoners of the revolution as a result of this March of the Women in October 1789. Well, things settled down for a while because the king, he said he accepted these changes. France was moving to a constitutional monarchy. France would become a constitutional representative monarchy with a king at the top, like the English had. That was the idea. And also notably, there would be no democracy. This was not, you had to have substantial property to participate in politics. It's not a question of establishing, at this point, establishing a democratic government. Well, what happened over the next 3 years was constant maneuvering between the king, the court, Marie Antoinette, the nobles, the upper clergy. They kept maneuvering, trying to sort of limit the activities of the National Assembly. And meanwhile, the economic situation deteriorated, particularly because in 1791, there was the Haitian Revolution, which I explained last time. And that was the focal point of the French overseas trade. And so the French economy entered into a big economic crisis at that time. And meanwhile, the other governments on the continent of Europe, but also the English, began to become hostile to the French Revolution. They felt threatened by this immense popular uprising. And so by 1792, the Austrian state, Marie Antoinette came from Austria, and Prussia, the two biggest powers in Central Europe, declared war on France, or maybe it was vice versa. There were a series of provocations. And the armies of the Austrians and the Prussians were marching on France. And a counter-revolution was developing within French society because particularly the church, which of all the established groups had some influence on the people. Many people, especially in the more remote areas of France, were still strong believers. And they followed the church, these peasants. And so the counter-revolution in France was spreading as the situation deteriorated. So you have the revolutionaries and you have the counter-revolution, which consists of foreign invasion and also internal subversion. The result was that in 1792, the monarchy was overthrown by the Paris people, and France became a republic. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they were imprisoned, and eventually they were guillotined by the Republican government. And a new group took power, leading a political party that had emerged all over France, composed of the most radical of the middle class, Jacobins, they were called, Jacobins, and they came to be led by a man by the name of Robespierre. Robespierre, again, key words, you'll find it in key words. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre. And these were the equivalent, if you like, of the Communist Party and so on in the Bolshevik Revolution and elsewhere, the Chinese Revolution. They believed in Republican government, away with the monarchy, and way with the vestiges of the old regime, and we're going to have a republic, let the Americans have a republic. That was their idea. Now, they did take important social and economic measures, but you should understand these are middle-class people. And so the revolution entered a radical phase, which we call the Reign of Terror. And I'll finish this up in the next class.